Our attention on Friday's newscast was obviously about the assisted dying bill in the UK Parliament. But there was a big story in Oxfordshire, which we will also address today.
Not just a big story, an absolutely incredible, extraordinary, astonishing story that's raised lots and lots of questions. A couple of protesters managed to break into a British military base, RAF Brize Norton, and they managed to spray paint some RAF planes, which every week we sit here and we talk about the security of the world. We talk about the dangers. We talk about the risks. Foreign news and defence have dominated the agenda for the last few months. And then lo and behold, a protest group managed to break into a British military base. Extraordinary.
Embarrassing and sort of career-threatening, I would imagine, for some people in the British security services, people who look after our bases. And the Prime Minister is particularly angry about it and has even talked about proscribing, which is the word for banning the organisation responsible. So we will unpack all of this, and Lyse Doucet will come along to help us on Iran-Israel in Saturday's newscast.
Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
It's Paddy in the studio.
And it is, as ever, a busy news weekend. But let's start then with that story yesterday, that break-in to RAF Brize Norton in Oxfordshire. People will know the name probably of Brize Norton. It's where often Britain's large planes leave and arrive. They have refuelling planes there. It became well known for all the wrong reasons, do you remember, during a period, because it's when often casualties and the bodies of British military who'd been out in Afghanistan and Iraq were brought home. So we used to see Brize Norton often on the TV when you'd see grieving families go to that base to see their loved ones being brought home after everything went wrong in their military service. This time, however, it's in the news because Palestine Action, this protest group with very strong feelings about what's going on in the Middle East, managed to break in and daub graffiti on two of the planes. So, Paddy, what are they all about, Palestine Action?
So this group targets groups, firms and geographies that they say are directly responsible in Israel's military might, in fueling, supporting, making, contributing to Israel's military might. And so therefore they use direct action, saying that these firms are complicit in the murder of Palestinian children. That's what they would say.
And they've done similar things like this before. In May, they claimed responsibility for spraying a US military plane in Ireland with red paint. As you say, they've done things like attack the offices of arms firms, and they're trying to grab attention. They're trying to make headlines. They're trying to make their point by grabbing the news spotlight. And in that way, they're a bit like Extinction Rebellion, were the environmental activists who made names for themselves by causing disruption and doing things like, throwing oil at famous paintings. But this, when it comes to military security in this country at this time, when security and defence is at the top of the news agenda, is something that the political establishment in the UK, you can imagine, were absolutely furious about. Keir Starmer said the act of vandalism committed at Brize Norton is disgraceful. It is our responsibility to support those who defend us. But a spokesperson for Palestine Action said, when our government fails to uphold their moral and legal obligations, it's the responsibility of ordinary citizens to take direct action. They claim to represent every individual, using their words, who's opposed to Israel's military action in Gaza, adding, if they want to ban us, they ban us all.
And at least one of the firms targeted by Palestine Action denies that they're involved in the military chain of supply. So it's quite complicated already to look at who supplies what to the Israeli military. So it is a tangled web, military supply. Palestine Action have got onto one of Britain's best known Royal Air Force bases. Now, it is in other era that could have been cause to resign for the various secretaries of state who are responsible.
And it would have been also a much bigger news story, but because the bandwidth, quite understandably, was taken up so much yesterday and indeed into the news this morning, and we're talking at 2:10 on Saturday about the historic vote in the Commons yesterday over assisted dying. On a different day, this story would have been absolutely ginormous, and you can imagine there would have been calls for a statement in Parliament. There might have been questions for the Defence Secretary, who's expressed his horror, and you've seen sort of just about every politician in the country express their outrage at the action that was taken. But there are questions, absolutely, for the government and for the military about whether the outrage was really that they managed to breach what looked like an old chain link fence. I mean, when you look at it, the TV pictures, you do think, how on earth could this have actually been able to happen? Now, I suppose the defence to that would be, the metaphorical defence rather than the literal defence would be, these are huge properties. They have security, they have patrols, but you can't be in every place all of the time. And it was interesting, one of the people who, I think was an MP who was formerly in the RAF, was interviewed about this yesterday and said, I thought this was maybe an accident waiting to happen. I didn't think at the time that security was very strong. It's also worth saying there was a former top brass military person interviewed about what happened yesterday who said, actually, the protesters have got this wrong. The planes there are not planes that were being used in any way, shape or form to aid and abet Israel. They're not planes that even would be capable of refueling American jets because basically their parts wouldn't fit. So there's a question about whether or not the protesters were actually going after legitimate targets who would be directly involved in any UK attempt to help Israel in any way. But, whatever the details are, the fact that this was able to happen on a British military base at a time like this, when there are clearly lots of security threats to the UK. There's another story that at 2:10 this afternoon, we're not sure how the facts will be established, but there is a suggestion there's been an arrest in Cyprus with somebody allegedly connected to the Iranians targeting the British base Akrotiri there.
And also, just to join the dots, planes from Brize Norton do fly to our base in Cyprus. That's a matter of public record. So the direct action part of Palestine Action say that loops them in. That's why they got the spray paint treatment. It's all part of highlighting the supply chain in the world. That's what they say. However, the Prime Minister has responded by saying this group could now be prescribed as a terrorist organisation in the United Kingdom under strict laws which came in as a result of terrorist groups which bomb civilians and kill civilians in the name of a cause, fill in the gap here.
And they would join the list with organisations like Hamas, for example, the group that has carried out all sorts of terrible things and atrocities, the group that has been in control of Gaza, making Gazans' life in very many circumstances an absolute misery, but the group that is engaged in military battles with Israel and the group that has been, part of that terrible conflict over there. So Palestine Action would join the list alongside those kinds of organisations. There is therefore running a political argument about whether or not that's an appropriate use of the law, because Palestine Action are a direct action group. They are not, I suppose, in a kind of common sense terms, would we say today that they are the same kind of group, the same kind of people that are in an organisation like Hamas that take hostages and enter into military conflicts and run militias? I think most people looking at that would think, well, no, they're not that. They are an extreme form of protester, but they are protesters.
Because here's what the prescription under the Terrorism Act of year 2000 would do. If it was prescribed, it would be a criminal offence to belong to the organisation, invite support for it. We've got the same list, Laura. I don't want to take all the airtime. Recklessly express support for a prescribed organisation.
Arrange a meeting in support of the organisation, wear clothing or carry articles in public which arouse suspicion that an individual is a member or supporter of the organisation, or publish an image of an article such as a flag or logo in the same kinds of circumstances. So there is a debate underway about whether or not this is sledgehammer and nut time. However, yesterday, as this story broke, I think the level of anger and embarrassment, frankly, in Westminster was such that there is this plan to ban this group.
You're right to say, we can make a lot of rhetorical noise about this. It's a serious breach. Prime Minister said this organisation could be prescribed. Newscasters will have a lot to say and think about this, so that's why we're covering it today. And there is news on what will happen around the UK.
Yeah, there's going to be a security review now of defence bases, as you would expect. And I think for the government, they've got so much on their plate in terms of defence and security. Frankly, from a sort of practical point of view, the last thing they need now is a sort of domestic threat of a new kind of group trying to carry out disruption in this way. Remember, actually, at some point, how much disruption Extinction Rebellion managed to cause in some cities around the UK. These kinds of protests, even if they have very small numbers of people, can actually have quite big consequences. And though, you know, the way that they did it with an electric scooter and using repurposed fire extinguishers, it almost sounds like it might be sort of farcical. Actually, this is deadly serious. And it's about whether or not our defence establishment has a grip on the most basic things.
They call it resilience.
Resilience. And the most basic of things as well. You know, can you climb over a fence when the fence is all that protects the public? Sorry, when the fence is all that protects planes worth millions of pounds that need to be safe and secure from the outside world.
And our armed forces personnel themselves.
Yeah.
So there we are. We wrap it together. There would have been more coverage, we admit, of this, but there was a big issue for
a huge issue
podcasters, newscasters on Friday. So we'll draw that to a close and get to grips with some questions we've received and pointers about Iran-Israel.
So, as promised, we are now going to focus on the biggest story in the world right now, which is the ongoing conflict between Iran and Israel. And I'm pleased to say our chief international correspondent, Lyse Doucet, joins us on the line. Lyse, hello.
Hello, I rushed from the airport to speak with you.
Oh, great. So you've just landed back from Geneva, where European foreign ministers were meeting the Iranian foreign minister for talks, I suppose, in the desperate hope that diplomacy might be able to move the dial here or bring at least a temporary end to the violence going on between the two countries. But there were more strikes overnight. What would be great, though, Lyse, is we've got a whole host of questions from newscasters about this really complicated situation. So if we can put them to you in the next 10 minutes or so, I think that would be really great.
There is a lot of questions and a lot of very consequential questions to be asking.
OK, so Kerry's gone first. Hi there, Lyse. Hearing about these bunker-busting bombs from the USA, which may or may not be used, this occurred to me. No one seems to be concerned or talking about fallout from environmental impacts. Could such a bomb create its own ticking time bomb, leaking into the environment, as it can't be controlled and contained once it's blown up?
Yes, that must be on everyone's mind. And thank you very much for that really good question. I'm going to begin by repeating what the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, has continued to say, and I'm going to quote him. I've repeatedly stated that nuclear facilities must never be attacked, regardless of the context or the circumstances. But now, of course, they're being attacked on a daily basis. So this does raise concerns. But we have to make a difference between an enrichment site and sites where there is a nuclear reactor. And the site that you raise, which is Ferdo, which is buried deep in the mountainside and can really only be reached and potentially destroyed by these, what's called the MOP, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, GBU 57, that only the United States has. But there's no enrichment taking there. So the attack and a blast from a bomb wouldn't trigger radioactive, what they call fission products. And the experts say, and I'm sure many people are looking at what the experts say, is that with uranium, radiation doesn't travel very far. And that's also the case when it comes to Natanz, which is another site which has been hit by Israel. We understand there has been damage at the site. And I'll underline that every day this is being monitored very closely by IAEA inspectors. They're still on the ground and far away to make sure there's no dangerous levels of radiation. But what would set alarm bells ringing if Iran's nuclear reactor, which is operational at Bushehr in the south of the country, is hit? Rafael Grossi has warned that would be absolutely catastrophic. But it's not regarded as a nuclear site, which is connected to the allegations that Israel and others make that Iran has a program headed toward a nuclear bomb. Bushehr is not regarded as being part of that. So far, it's not been targeted, and it's not expected to be targeted. So we can breathe a little easier. I should say, though, that even at the nuclear enrichment sites, there is a danger of some kind of contamination that could have health effects locally. There's a lot of uranium that naturally occurs all around us, but it wouldn't be catastrophic.
So concern, yes, But profound danger right now on this issue? Not necessarily. Okay, let's move on.
No.
Evan emailed us saying, after avidly listening to Election Cast every night during my holiday last year, it's nice to hear, I thought I'd take a break from the news during my holiday, but the news found me during my time in Jordan with the closure of Jordanian airspace, nightly air raid sirens, and the opportunity to see the Iron Dome, that's the Israel defense system, in action. We've heard a lot about the potential response of the USA, but not about other countries. I'm thinking particularly of Saudi Arabia, which on one hand is waging a proxy war against Iran in Yemen, but on the other doesn't recognise Israel. Could other countries in the region end up being sucked into the war?
I think all of us on this podcast feel your pain, that expression, the news found me. It's a very important question. In the past few years, the age-old rivalries between Iran and its Arab neighbors have been eased by a rapprochement of sorts between Iran and Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain. So they don't want a war in the region. It's interesting because when the last nuclear deal was agreed in 2015, all of these Arab Gulf states said they were really angry about it. They said, we don't want you to make a deal with Iran. Iran is our enemy. Fast forward a decade, they've been telling the United States, we don't want a war. This will be existential for us. So they wouldn't be dragged into it. But where they would be affected is that is a very tightly packed region. And then there had been some threats from lawmakers in Iran saying, okay, we're going to retaliate by cutting off the Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz, the absolutely vital waterways in the Gulf, which are, of course, the main avenues for the transport of oil and other goods that the world relies on. And a lot of these countries' revenues rely on. And for countries, for example, like Qatar, when President Trump recently visited, Qatar said, if there is an all-out war in Iran, this is existential for us. We're just literally across the water. So they really, really don't want this war to escalate. And they have certainly been on the phone talking to President Trump, trying to convince him not to get involved. Because if the United States intervenes militarily at what is already a perilous and unpredictable war, could then go in all kinds of directions, which would be very, very dangerous. And that was one of the messages we heard in Geneva from Britain's Foreign Secretary David Lammy and the other European ministers who warned about a perilous moment.
Also, let me add, as someone who sits here with Laura every week, that when Hamas launched its attack on October the 7th, it did it as it was thought Saudi Arabia was close to recognising Israel. So I think another part of Evan's question does raise the whole point of what any peace in the Middle East could ever look like.
But let me just make a point clear that in President Trump's first term, one of his proud foreign policy achievements was what was called the Abraham Accords, where there were a number of Arab states who normalized relations with Israel. Some of them did it under pressure or with transactions with the United States. But the prize in that is always regarded as being Saudi Arabia, which is the custodian of the two holiest sites in Islam. But Saudi Arabia has made it crystal clear that that's not going to happen until there is a pathway to a Palestinian state. And right now, Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it absolutely clear repeatedly that he has spent a lifetime making sure that doesn't happen. And he has a lot of support in his right-wing cabinet now on that front.
So then we get to Zach's email. I wanted to know if the US ends up attacking Iran, then Iran retaliates by striking a US airbase in the region or similar. Will that trigger NATO Article 5, requiring all the other NATO countries to come to the US aid? Is this only the case if Iran strikes US soil itself? And if that's the case, is it at all likely that Iran would attack US soil, or would it just stick to US air bases and similar in the region?
I'm very impressed by the questions of Newscast listeners. They're very detailed, and it shows that they're doing a lot of research into not content with just hearing the warnings of a possible escalation, but looking to see what kind of shape it could take. If, for example, a US base in Qatar or Iraq, anywhere in the neighborhood was attacked, foreign military bases remain under the sovereignty of the host country, even though U.S. military bases would be under the exclusive control and legal jurisdiction of that area. They'd be the one controlling the gates, controlling what happens inside, but they don't. It's not sovereign U.S. territory. Embassies are a little bit different. They're also not sovereign territory, but they're protected by the Vienna Convention, so they have a little bit more significance to them. But we have seen in the last 20 months of war, when it started, that some of Iran's proxies and partners in the region, in Iraq and in Syria, they did attack U.S. military bases. U.S. soldiers were injured or killed, and this was seen as a provocation, but it didn't trigger Article 5.
And it's the NATO summit this week. So in the next 48, 72 hours, you're going to hear a lot more about this all over again, with world leaders heading to The Hague for that summit with the new NATO chief, Mark Rutte, saying to them with American backing, time to put your money where your mouth is, chaps.
Lyse, we're going to say goodbye to you, except this being Newscast, we want to know, how was Geneva? What's the relations between the Iranians and the Europeans? Is there any small talk? Does anyone get on with each other? Have they known each other years? What's the kind of diplomatic hubbub in the corridors that you've just left?
I have to say the mood was grim in otherwise beautiful luxury hotel in Geneva. And I have to say I was flooded with memories of a decade ago when we went from one European city to the next. My normal work doesn't take me to luxury hotels in many places, but covering the Iran nuclear negotiations a decade ago meant we spent a lot of time on them. Of course, that deal in 2015 was a huge achievement. President Trump pulled out of it in 2018 in his first term under pressure from Prime Minister Netanyahu. So there I was standing in the crush of journalists, and my colleague and friend Lindsay Hilsum of Channel 4 was nearby, and I thought, what are we doing? We're still in a crush of journalists a decade on. And these people know each other. Abbas Araghchi, who's Iran's foreign minister, the head of the delegation, he was the deputy foreign minister the first time round, and so he knows every inch of this nuclear file. He also knows many of Europe's top diplomats. So they have past relationships, but this was really a time for very tough messages. David Lammy flew. I watched him arriving at the hotel. He had his white trainers on. He rushed into the hotel. I don't know how much sleep he got on the red-eye flight from Washington, but he came in with a very, very tough message after having seen Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, Steve Witkoff, who is President Trump's envoy for everything. And he conveyed that to the Iranians, basically to say the military threat is real, of the United States becoming more directly involved in the Iran-Israel confrontation. But there is still a narrow pathway. And that message also was amplified by the other European foreign ministers. You could feel the tension. But I have to say, watching it and listening to their statements, I felt the clock of war is ticking more loudly than the clock of peace. President Trump has talked about this 2 weeks. It's a phrase he uses a lot, and it's never really exactly 2 weeks. Could be 2 days, could be 2 months, but he uses it as a means to give himself more time, and it may be time for diplomacy or time to prepare military strikes. But there isn't a lot of time to do a deal, and so far Iran is saying, well, we're not going to talk to you until you stop Israel from attacking us. And right now, there seems to be almost no chance of that.
Lyse, thank you so much for helping us answer newscasters' questions. Always great to have you with us at the weekend. Welcome home.
Always great to be with you.
It's interesting, in the hours immediately after those European meetings, President Trump came out and basically said, well, no one's listening to Europe anyway. So you have these tense meetings, David Lammy and Barrot, the French Foreign Minister, Kaja Kallas, the EU diplomatic chief. They're obviously all trying really, really hard. But Trump seems like he's playing on a completely different pitch in a sense. I mean, he even said out loud on the record, the American president said, nobody's listening to Europe. The Iranians don't really want to listen to them, questioning whether this diplomacy is even worth it at all. And for Keir Starmer, it may become a profoundly difficult question. If Donald Trump says, hey, UK, join me on this track, give me permission to take my American planes that are going to help Israel blow up this bunker, allow me to do that from British bases, or ask your planes to come and refuel mine in midair on their way to blow up an Iranian bunker. Can you imagine a British Prime Minister saying no to an American ask like that?
Yeah, and also...
Can you imagine a Labour Prime Minister saying yes to tacit UK involvement in another conflict in the Middle East.
And not just another conflict, another conflict over weapons of mass destruction, in which the legal advice of the Attorney General's interest, of public interest, that's a complete read across from the Labour's Tony Blair's war. But I just wanted to make the point, because it's a podcast that's going to end soon.
Yes.
The Iranian regime tells women what to wear, beats them up if they don't wear the right clothes, hangs gay men, is full of people who wish the West ill, and it's claimed have been carrying out attacks on our interests.
So what will Donald Trump decide? And what will he ask of the UK? And conveniently, if you want more of this, I've written a piece about this for the BBC website that is on the web at the moment, trying to untangle some of these. And I also found the answer to a great quiz question, which I bet newscasters will know the answer to, but I'm going to ask you.
Yes.
What was the name of the first person who was responsible for paying for finding oil in what was Persia, then Iran, back in 1908?
The name of the person who found the oil.
Well, the name of the person who did the deal to do the exploration.
The name of the person who did the deal to do the exploration. Kitchener?
William Knox Darcy, who was a British businessman. He'd made a packet from gold in Australia. He then almost gave up on finding oil in Persia, but found oil in Persia in 1908. That company became BP. Britain's involvement then in Iran and the wider Middle East and the oil industry was the first steps in the very long journey that gets us to this point. History always informs these questions. But this is why, even though you might think that Britain is not a huge player in the diplomacy of all of this, actually, this is one of the reasons why Britain, people were saying to me yesterday, is still in some senses sort of prominent in the Iranian mind, because we have a whole tangled history between our two countries. This is not all about just America and Israel. And there's a question I think that's really interesting as well that people have been saying to me, has the UK done enough thinking about Iran itself rather than just seeing sort of the world Middle East policy through the very fraught questions between Israelis and Palestinians? But there's an awful lot of podcasts you could do about all of that. But I tried to get to the bottom of some of it for the website today.
So thank you for listening, and we'll join you on Sunday's newscast.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.